All right, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to work on the express endpoint that serves the Markdown. By the end of this lesson, we'll have our posts displaying again in the client. So we're going to start where we left off in the last episode. If you need to catch up, git checkout Redux client. So right now in our Express server, we have a pretty simple endpoint that just returns the parameters that we've given, in this case slug. We want to set up this endpoint to serve Markdown as a JSON blob, so our client can parse it and use it in our React component. To do this, we're going to need to install a few packages. If you remember, inside of our Webpack dev client, we have a Markdown with front matter loader. If you look that up in packagelock.json, you can see it requires a couple of packages, marked and YAML front matter. So let's use these packages so we're not doubling up code. In the terminal, let's npm install marked and YAML front matter. All right, cool. Now inside Express.js, let's import these. We'll import marked from marked. We'll import load front from YAML front matter. And finally, let's import fs from fs. This is the file system package we're going to use to grab the file. All right, so now inside our endpoint, let's get rid of this. And let's set up our first two variables that we always need, the site and the slug. We'll say const site equals request hostname. We'll split it by the period, and we'll grab the first element. So this is our link or Zelda. Now in production, you might want to do link.com. And if you had a link.org, they would show up as the same site. And so that's a problem. The solution to that might be to not split this by the period, but instead do a dot replace. We'll replace periods with underscores. And so now it'll be link_com as the site. Of course, you'd have to set up your directories in data to be the same thing. But for right now, let's just continue the way we've been working. The second variable is our slug. And we're going to pull the slug from the request params, since it's right here. We've named it and everything. Right on, now we need an if statement to make sure we have a slug. So if there's no slug, we want to throw an error. So whenever we throw an error, it's good practice to wrap that in a try block so we can properly catch the error. Let's do catch error. And inside this catch, we'll say res status 404, and we'll send it our error. So we want to fall back to not found everywhere inside this. So the server will always return a 404 if something goes wrong. Now we can start digging into the file system. So let's create a new constant called file. That's going to be equal to the path resolve dir name now let's back up 2 and go into data. We use our first variable site, and we'll use our second variable slug. Finally, we'll put a .md on the end, and so that should match with this, the site slug. So technically this should be able to search any file within data. If it's Markdown, then we'll create a path out of that. So that's what file is, it'll be the path. So now let's open that path. So we want to use fs, we say read file. We give it the path. The second argument is the encoding. In our case it's UTF-8. In most cases it's going to be UTF-8. And the third argument is a function. That function takes an error and data as its arguments. So first let's check and see if there's an error. If an error exists, we're going to do the same thing we did down here. We're going to say res status, and we'll send that error along. Finally, we want to return to get out of this function. If there's no error, we can start parsing the Markdown. Let's create a new object, and we'll call load front on our data. Remember, the data is the string that's returned right here. So now it's being parsed. If you look at a Markdown file, the front matter is up here. But this function is going to parse the Markdown as well. And it's going to put that into the object under the __ content property. So now we want to parse that into HTML. So we're going to use our marked library, which we imported, and we're going to pass that the object __ content. All right, so we're just rewriting content here to be the HTML form as opposed to the Markdown form. We could create a new property on here, call it parsed, and that would be just the HTML. Call it HTML, whatever you want to call it. All right, So finally, if everything's properly parsed and it's all JSON now in this object, we'll just response JSON and send back the object. Pretty simple. Now the last thing we want to do is go into our ArticleJS component, and let's change the connect here. So we have content down here equals state content. Inside our reducers, we're giving content the entire payload. And since our entire payload is that object, there's actually a couple of things we want. We want the title, we want the poster image, and finally we want the underscore content. So instead of setting content to state content, we want to spread state content over the props. So now title will be a prop, and underscore content will be a prop. So we can change this. Poster image is also a prop. All right, so let's try it out so you can see what this all looks like. We'll say npm run dev. So it builds successfully. And there it is. We've got the Markdown coming in. We can see we have this endpoint right here. It gives us the full object. Author, poster image, title, content. Inside of our Redux DevTools, we can see the fetch success changes the content. So now our state has a content property, which has all the article stuff inside. So if we will go back to about and then to article 2, we see another action. We're fetching, once again, we're changing this content from the old stuff to the new stuff. And you can see the diff right here. That's pretty cool. So does Zelda work just as well? Yeah, looks good. So to wrap up this episode, I wanted to change the store one more time because everything's pretty great, except we don't have hot reloading of our reducers. So let's go into store.js. So right now we have our export default returning the output of create store. So we need to set up some hot reloading code before we return this create store. So instead of return, let's assign it to a variable. We'll call it store, and then we'll return store, right? So that's exactly the same as we had before. But now inside here, we can do the same thing we did in app.js. See this if module hot part? So that works in reducers as well. So we'll say if module hot except reducers. So if the hot file coming in is reducers, it's going to run this function. So this is going to use a helper function on store. So we'll say store replace reducer. That's a pretty cool function. So as an argument to this function, we're going to require the file we'd like to switch it out for. And because we're only bringing in one reducer, we need to put that reducer on there. Fetch article. So if you're bringing in a bunch of reducers using combined reducers, you would need to do this extra function here. So let's set this up. Let's figure this out. We're going to save that. You're going to see it reloads. So what should we change? So let's go to our reducers. And so action payload have extra stuff on it if we want. Action payload test equals test. So now if we go into our Redux store, we can see that test has changed. Now the hot reloading isn't going to change the data in the app, but it's not going to reload the page when we change it either. So if we say change, this is the same. But if we go to a different page, we'll come back and we'll see that test is now changed. Nothing reloaded. Down here in the output, you can see that we're checking for updates and we're updating the reducer inline. So now we have hot reloading on our reducers using this simple piece of code we put into store. Not too bad. So we did it. We set up an API endpoint for fetching our posts. And we updated our article component so that it pulls in the full page. We no longer have to include the Markdown files in our final bundles, so that'll slim them right down. But if you notice, inside the source, we're still not rendering anything on the server side. All of this is only rendered once we load the page. And if you can see there, so there's kind of a lag before the API is called in ArticleJS on component did mount. So we want to do this on the server side as well. And that's what we're going to get into in the next episode. If you need to catch up, check out Redux Client Final. All right, so in the next episode, we're going to finish this thing up by rendering on the server side using promises. Should be pretty interesting. See you there.